Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war update extra. I'm going to give you an extra little bit of context for the war in Ukraine. And I'm going to pick up on a story that came out of the UK. I think I reported on it, was it this morning? Maybe yesterday. I was picked up on this by a couple of people, some people disagreeing with what I said. A couple of things before we get into the nitty gritty of this, and it's concerning asylum and refugee status on account of Ukraine being a country at war. These sorts of discussions are always divisive when we're talking about morality. Things are often pretty testy. I had this same situation as what I'm going to advocate here, where I'm sort of on one side, but not massively. When we were talking about the strikes on Iran, I actually changed my position on that. But I was hovering at just justifying it here to just not justifying it here. And I wasn't going to one extreme or another. But the problem is with humanity is we don't like uncertainty. And we very much like certainty. Like psychologically, and even you can talk about evolutionary psychology. Psychologically, we prefer certainty. It may well be kind of drilled into us over millennia. Now, something like the strikes on Iran and this discussion over the eligibility for refugee status, people like to either go hard one way or hard the other. With so much in life, we generally polarize, and we like the certainty of I definitely believe this, and anyone that doesn't believe what I believe is completely wrong, and therefore, you know, I don't like that at all. And it then becomes a divisive topic because it's kind of all or nothing. Whereas I advocate careful thought, nuance, and sometimes I'm just in the middle of that spectrum and I'm hovering and I'm not really massively one way or the other. Like, it's not a hill I'm going to die on. And so, you know, if you disagree with me, make sure that like you're understanding that I'm not massively committed to this any given point that we're discussing. Not always. Sometimes I'm really like just supportive, the general support of Ukraine, like politically and morally. I'm massively in support of Ukraine. So you can put me over into that. Yeah, I'm well in that camp. But other things, there's more nuance. So we're going to talk in the context of the UK, but this applies to many countries. In fact, every country who is taking Ukrainian refugees. So the story is Ukrainians who fled to the UK are being refused asylum on the grounds that it is, quote, safe to return. A law firm says it hears weekly from Ukrainians, including vulnerable women and children who were turned down. We're going to come down to this part of the article. Their refusal letters typically state that the conflict-related risks do not meet the threshold for persecution under the Refugee Convention, as they can relocate to safer parts of Ukraine where there are public services, and they can apply for help from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, and local organisations to avoid destitution. She said this was a, quote, concerning and growing trend, so this was an immigration lawyer, caused by updates made in January to the UK Home Office's guidance, which now deems regions such as Kyiv and Western Ukraine to be generally safe. She has observed that fewer of the asylum claims she works on have been successful since the update. Quote, this assessment runs counter to the reality of life on the ground in Ukraine. I think any rational person would understand that Ukraine remains in the midst of a violent war. With attacks intensifying in recent months, our clients would clearly face grave risks, including bombardment, conscription, family separation, and the psychological trauma of war if they were to return to Ukraine today, she said. Legally, these decisions are deeply troubling. They overlook the complex realities on the ground and fail to engage meaningfully with individual circumstances, particularly in light of Article 3 and 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which protect the rights to protection from harm and to liberty. Okay. There's a few issues here I have with this immigration expert, Halina Samchak, an immigration lawyer from Sterling Law, because she actually throws into conscription here as an issue. So the war refugee status here should really be about the harm, the risk to these people and their families and so on and so forth. Conscription, if you're running away just from the conscription, I've done a whole video on this before, you're not entitled necessarily to asylum status because of merely the risk of being conscripted into the armed forces, unless there are real issues with what's going on in the armed forces. And I don't want to sidebar this too much, but say the armed forces were, for example, Russia. I think you could justifiably seek refugee status on account of conscription in Russia because of the way that they are treated and breaking humanitarian law, just being in the army, these meat assaults, being forced to do X, Y, and Z. That is not the case in Ukraine. And so I don't think that is a valid argument here. And what's important to understand is that when we look at, say, the UK system, and, this might differ abroad, but although I'm applying this to everyone, it's not just UK centric. We're going to use the example of the UK here. Eligibility for asylum in the UK is to stay in the UK as a refugee. You must be unable to live safely in any part of your own country, because you fear persecution there. And, by persecution, if you fear being harmed in the war and whatnot. Okay, now, first comment I'm just going to point you towards concerning my views that were stated, and I didn't really flesh them out at all. They were just really quickly reported a news bit and said, I generally agree with this. But then another something here took a real issue with this. It said, in this video at 8 minutes 30, Jonathan shows us all how when he talks about rights, always frames them in a way that supports the interests of the British. He argues Ukrainians should be denied asylum and be sent to Ukraine to help with their efforts, arguing that there are safe places to live in Ukraine, and conveniently ignoring the ongoing kidnappings. Whenever you hear an opinion from Jonathan, ask yourself, is he actually helping Ukraine or Ukrainians, or does his opinions always fall into a narrative that conveniently benefits the UK the most? I mean, it really had nothing to do with the UK. It's the fact that I don't know what he also means by, assuming it's a he, the kidnappings, the ongoing kidnappings. We're talking about the kidnappings by Russians in occupied territories. Well, then that's in occupied territories in the war zone. But the point of my position is that there are very many areas of Ukraine now that are safe. Now, also, it's worth noting that my evaluation now would be very different from my evaluation in 2022. So if you fled Ukraine during the invasion when the Russians got right up to Kiev, absolutely well justified in leaving. No issue with that. And we can talk about whether those people, after say 3 years of living in another country, then should they have the rights to continue to live there, or should they be sent back and whatnot. But essentially, my position would be, actually, the war has moved into a state where I don't think people are completely unable to live in Ukraine. And I think they can access the services. And if the services aren't good enough, then the argument should be that actually they should be improved within Ukraine, and we should be fighting as the UK and as allied nations of Ukraine to support Ukraine in terms of the humanitarian and civic support for people who become internally displaced people, IDPs. So that's really important to note, that there is a difference now to what was going on 3 years ago, when you were thinking the whole country is going to get overtaken in 3 days, and etc., etc., etc. So I'm not trying to frame this to get the UK off the hook. I believe this is applicable to every single country. This is and I'm not trying to support the UK. If this had happened 3 years ago, I would have had issue with this. And in fact, I think I was criticising the UK for not doing enough for refugees at the time, because we weren't doing enough at the time. Our government then was dragging their feet in supporting the UK. So contrary to what another something says here, I was actually critical of the UK over refugee status or refugee processes at the beginning of the war. But I think now's a different time. And here we have Matt Bishop, and I really take this on board. So actually, JP, I completely disagree with you that Ukrainians should return home. I've rewritten my response 5 times, but it just sounds really nasty. So just imagine us relaxing down a local, sipping a nice pint, broadside Spitfire, and you saying that to me, and I just quietly ask you that if you feel this way, why haven't you taken your boys there? Personally, I feel I can do more for Ukraine from here. And he left Kharkiv totally understandably so, and went back to his native Australia with his Ukrainian wife and son. Now, I think that's actually an invalid argument. So I am not a Ukrainian citizen. I don't live in Ukraine, and I wouldn't take my boys. There's no reason for me to go and take my boys to Ukraine. Now, I think, though, that we could live safely in Ukraine. The percentage chance of us being embroiled in a war there compared to here is obviously very different, and it will depend where I went to set up. So if I went to somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains, Zakarpattia, we could have I presume, a pretty good chance or a very good chance of having a safe existence there. And in fact, even in places like Lviv and so on and so forth. Now, there are threats of missiles, but again, there are places that haven't received any missiles and any attention in Ukraine. And this presents quite a problem that, how much of a country has to be war-torn or under threat for you to qualify for refugee status. And again, it comes to stay in the UK as a refugee, you must be unable to live safely in any part of your own country. Is that true? So that's all I'm saying is that I think that we're at a stage where there is a good argument to be made that new applicants for refugee status should be turned down, because and then it gets onto other arguments. So I didn't really flesh out all of my arguments. I think I did sort of mention this, the idea that Ukraine really needs a people, right? It's under a lot of pressure. Now, I'm going to just take you through another couple of articles to kind of flesh out my position here. So this is Financial Times. Interestingly, this came out today, I think, 25 minutes ago when I was searching. So this is out today. It's an opinion piece, I think. Opinion piece on global migration. So wars are unpredictable, but one predictable consequence is that people run for their lives. As conflict flared again in the Middle East, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees warned last week that once people are forced to flee, there's no quick way back. And this is so important. Of course, you don't need to tell the Ukrainians that Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 caused Europe's biggest displacement crisis in decades as millions fled, most of them women and children. 3 years later, there are still more than 5 million Ukrainians living abroad. How are they doing? Did they find jobs? And will they ever go back? The good news is that they have found jobs at much higher rates than as is typical for refugees. Jean-Christophe Dumont, head of the International Migration Division at the OECD, told me that in many countries, their employment rate was, quote, already maybe twice what you would observe for other refugees. Although comparisons are tricky due to varied data sources, Ukrainians' employment rates appear particularly high in countries like Poland, where there were pre-existing migration flows and language similarities. In contrast, they are much lower in places such as Norway, and we're going to look at a Norwegian article in a second, where there is a bigger language barrier. Overall, their incomes are rising after a tough few years, according to regular surveys commissioned by the Center for Economic Strategy, a Ukrainian think tank. The proportion of refugees who said they had to save or borrow to afford clothing rose from 7% before the war to 28% by November 2022. But by December 2024, that share had decreased back to 7%. Why have they done better in the jobs market than other refugees? For a start, the macroeconomic environment helped. The displacement coincided with a time of unusually tight labour markets, especially in nearby countries like Poland and Czech Republic. Indeed, recent studies on those two countries suggest that Ukrainians have helped to fill job shortages with no sign they displaced native workers. Most countries also allowed people fleeing Ukraine to apply for jobs straight away. This is important. So the EU extended temporary protection status, which meant Ukrainians didn't have to apply for individual asylum and could instantly access jobs, housing, schooling and social welfare. They could also choose to settle in places with strong local job markets. In contrast, many countries ban individual asylum seekers from working while their applications are processed. The UK, for example, does not allow asylum seekers to work while their claims are considered, unless the process takes longer than 12 months, and gives them just £49.18 per week to live on. This sets people up to fail. A study of German data found that employment rates were about 20% lower for refugees who had to wait an additional 7 months before they were allowed to enter the labour market. It took up to a decade for this gap to disappear. On top of that, a survey across EU countries suggests that roughly 2/3 of Ukrainian refugees have tertiary education. More than 40% of respondents had a master's degree or higher. And not only are they more educated than most other refugee groups, they are more educated than many host country populations too. That said, many have had to take jobs for which they are overqualified, whether due to language barriers or the inability to convert credentials. OECD data suggests that displaced Ukrainians in Europe are concentrated in accommodation, food service, administration and manufacturing roles. Do they plan to return if the war ends? So this is where you get onto the key ideas of why I am broadly in favour of turning down particularly new refugee applications. Because not only do I believe that they are able to generally live in places in Ukraine that are safe enough, but also it's really counterproductive for what Ukraine needs at the moment, which is people and people to work and people to keep the economy alive. And I'm going to flesh that out a little more as well, but we'll start here. Do they plan to return if the war ends? Ukraine must hope so. The permanent loss of so many highly educated women would not be good news for a war-battered economy, while the loss of children would worsen its already poor demographic outlook. It's got the worst but it has the worst birth rates and the worst death rates in the world. Right? Demographically, Ukraine is in one hell of a position. But the relatively successful integration of Ukrainian refugees abroad, albeit with the caveat of underutilized skills, could become a double-edged sword for Ukraine. The more people settle in, the less they want to go back. According to CES surveys, the share of refugees who say they want to definitely plan to return has dropped from 50% in November 2022 to 20% in December last year. A well-funded effort supported by international community to rebuild housing and economic capacity would probably encourage some to return. And of course, there could be some advantages to Ukraine in having a vast diaspora community, which could assist with remittances, investment and trade links. But it is a reminder that once war begins and people scatter, it's very hard to put all the pieces back together. We're going to go back to the article in The Guardian and look at these statistics here. This is a real problem for Ukraine, and part of why I suggest refusing war refugee status to new Ukrainian applicants is that you look at what happens when you lose people to another country and they stay there and they have children, and those children get embedded in the education system, friends and links and language and so on. So in November 2022, something like 50% of refugees said definitely yes, that they would plan to return after the war. Definitely plan to return to Ukraine. 24% said possibly. So you had like 74% there of those two. Now, in December 2024, 50% had dropped to 20%, and the possibly stayed at around 23%. So you got 43% down from 74%. That is a massive issue for Ukraine because they're losing people, and the longer you lose them and they don't come back, then you lose them forever. And then you lose the amount of investment you put in these people in terms of education and training. You lose them as taxpayers, as having skills, as all of the things that allow your country to sustain itself economically and socially. So that is an issue. In fact, this Norwegian article here says Ukraine faces a massive emigration problem. It's a real headache. Trust in Ukrainian authorities weighs heavily when refugees consider returning. A new report shows how both politics and personal circumstances shape the decision to stay or go back. And I'm only going to look into a little bit of this. It says population trends are a major headache for Ukrainian authorities, Holm Hansen explains. Quote, they're facing a massive emigration problem driven by both labour migration and war. There's simply a shortage of people to work and pay taxes. According to Holm Hansen, trust in the Ukrainian government is the single most important factor when people consider returning. Without trust, the likelihood of return is low. Quote, family situation also plays a big role. If you have children under 18 in Norway, the motivation to return is lower. If you have a spouse or children in Ukraine, the motivation increases, he says. It's not always the most resourceful refugees who return. Quote, those returning now are often older and more likely to have health issues than the rest of the population, he adds. As a result, they contribute little to the Ukrainian labour force, which the government is eager to strengthen. So the Ukrainian government really wants to solve this issue, right? They know, and this has been an issue for some time. There have been European countries who've been toying with the idea of whether they force Ukrainians back to Ukraine to both help Ukraine and to alleviate strain on their own services, although there are arguments that refugees and Ukrainian migrants in, say, Poland, and I think Germany, was it the stats I read recently, was it Poland? They've contributed way more to the economy of that country than they had drawn from it. So these are net contributors. So anyway, what shapes a wish to return, says this article: trust in authorities. Low trust in Ukrainian authorities reduces willingness to return. Children's future. Parents prioritise safety and education, both in Norway and Ukraine. Family situation. Children in Norway reduce return motivation, while family in Ukraine increases it. Fear of stigmatisation. Many fear negative attitudes, but returnees report little blame so far. So they're like thinking that if I return, there's going to be a stigma for me. People are going to look at me saying, why did you run away when we didn't run away? That kind of thing. But actually, apparently, that doesn't exist, but it's a perception they have. Practical information. There is need for clear guidance on the return process and rights. Return policy and development. Ukraine is working on measures like dual citizenship, which I've reported on, and information campaigns. Okay, so lots more to be said on this, but I don't want this to be too long and weighed down. This is a divisive subject, and I don't have the personal experience of being a citizen in a war-torn country. I've been to Ukraine a couple of times, and I have seen areas where you definitely wouldn't want to live. But I've also seen areas where living looked pretty safe. And that's the problem, is you've got a country of two countries. And then sometimes in some of these other places, like Kyiv, which is broadly safe, you get a massive barrage and you're thinking the percentage chance of me dying or being injured is certainly vastly higher than it is would I be living on the south coast of the UK. The question, as ever, and this is why I always talk about the Socrates paradox and demarcation on a spectrum, is you have arbitrary demarcation points. So Socrates paradox is you've got a sand dune. You take a grain of sand off it. Is it still a sand dune? Well, yeah. You keep doing that, and at no point does it go really obviously and explicitly from being a sand dune to not a sand dune. And the point is you then get to 0 grains of sand and you haven't yet found a place where it turns into not a sand dune. So you've got this paradox where you've got no sand and it's still a sand dune. So the point of that thought experiment is that when you have things that exist on a graduated spectrum that represents change. And this is called the species problem in evolution. Darwin knew about this in evolution. He says that here we've got this evolution of organisms going from this point to this point, huge evolutionary process. And here you've got Homo sapiens sapiens, and here you've got, I don't know, some kind of protozoa or whatever. And what we do is we draw these lines going here, 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 and say this is this species, that is that species, that is that species. But that species does not give birth to a non-species. There is no one point where we draw a line. You look at millions of years and go, right, that's these people here. Oh look, Homo australopithecus, and these people are these organisms are Homo whatever it is, another one, Homo erectus or whatever it is, and but that dividing line is arbitrary. And we've drawn it down there. And the problem is when you find skulls that exist around that time period where you've drawn this arbitrary line, paleontologists cannot decide which species they belong to because they kind of belong to both. You've just drawn a line and one doesn't give birth to a not one, right? Okay, so this problem exists on any kind of spectrum where you're demarcating the spectrum. So going back to a country that's war-torn, at what point does a war-torn country go from being that's too dangerous to live in to that's acceptable to live in? And that will be a subjective interpretation where you go and there's a fuzzy area and some people say, no, that's fine. You can still live there. There are parts of the country you can still live in. And other people say, no, you're fully justified in getting out of Dodge. and we'll have disagreements of that. The other problem, and I'm going to get a little bit philosophical here, this is a problem that Immanuel Kant talked about. So Immanuel Kant, and I actually don't agree with categorical imperatives. He would say, like, it's wrong to lie. It's categorically wrong to lie. And I'd say, well, what if it's called the inquiring murderer thought experiment? What if a murderer came round to your house, a child murderer, and said, where's Jack and Jill? And you knew that Jack and Jill were playing upstairs in the bedroom. And you're like, oh, I don't know where Jack and Jill is. I think I saw them go down the street about a couple of hours ago. And so the murderer walks off. Like, it's good to lie then. So context can change things, and the way that we morally evaluate can be different. So as a consequentialist generally, but I'm not strictly, I don't want to go down the whole route of what I'm actually a moral skeptic. So morality doesn't exist. We construct it, but all our models that we construct have problems. There's no one perfect moral value system. They're all flawed, which is why after 3,000 years of moral philosophy, no one agrees. Like literally you look at stats and it's still like third. No one agrees on moral philosophy. But we try and make a best fit. Now, Immanuel Kant was what's called a deontologist. So he would argue that there's objective morality. It just kind of exists outside of our brains. And there are these categories of things like lying, which is just wrong. Now, I disagree with that. But one interesting idea that he had was the universalization of morality. So the universalization of morality can broadly be boiled down to, what would the world look like if everyone did it? If it's a good thing to do, then the world would look like a better place if everyone did it, right? So lying, and it's a good example there. So if everyone lied, what would the world look? So I can argue that in the odd situation, lying can be beneficial, but actually broadly as a rule of thumb, it's bad. That's how I would see it. Whereas Kant will say, well, even if it was still bad to lie to the murderer. And then he would have to tinker with other things to explain all that. But when we're talking rules of thumb, though, like this is a good approach to take, which is like, why is lying bad? Well, if everyone in the world lied, it would just be absolute chaos. So Immanuel Kant makes a case for living by freely chosen maxims, private rules, that would be moral if made law for all. He essentially enjoins the individual who ponders what to do in a moral situation to ask herself, what if everyone did that? Now, what I want you to do then is say, right, there are loads of people in Ukraine at the moment. Now, at the beginning of the war, when you're thinking Ukraine is just going to collapse, I think you can definitely justify people fleeing the country with their children and for their own and their children's safety, etc., etc. Absolutely 100%. Right now, it's more difficult to justify because there are places in Ukraine that you can live. And, rather than us in the UK spending money on, housing refugees and supporting refugees here, we can put that money into supporting Ukraine, supporting internally displaced people. Because it's actually beneficial that Ukraine keeps hold of these people to work within the economy and society and so on and so forth. And then there's less chance that they leave and don't come back because the stats look bad for people who leave the country, and the longer they are away from the country, it's just the less likely they are going to return. So if we approach the problem with universalization, what would it look like if everyone right now decided it is a good thing to take refugee status? And if everyone left the Ukraine now, you would have no country left to fight for. And in fact, you'd have no soldiers. And in fact, Russia would just walk in and take the entire country. And that's an interesting predicament there, to apply universalization to the issue of war refugee status. Can we justify, like, if it's good for one person, then surely it's good for them all. Surely it's the right thing for them all to do. Now, the situation is that most people in Ukraine that are living outside of the immediate frontline areas live in relative safety. Okay, Sumy is now dodgy at the top, and even Sumy City, and certainly in the east and anywhere near the front lines, obviously you've got problems. But if you can build up a case that the front lines aren't going to massively change, which I don't think they are, then the rest of the country, or certainly the west of the country, looks somewhat safe. So, if everyone left the country, it would completely fall apart. So, no one is advocating that everyone leaves, right? then that becomes a problem. Well, why do you allow some people to leave and take refugee status in the United Kingdom or any other country on earth, and yet it's fine for everyone else to stay? So there's a little bit of double standards going on here. And when I make these kind of proclamations, it's not that I make them without thinking about them at all. I think about a lot of things, and I think quite deeply about them. And even when I cast like a quick judgment, it's often based on earlier previous thoughts, and it builds up. It's a wall that gets built up, and I don't just have a conclusion that is a castle in the air. Like, I've written a book on exactly this, on how to build up worldviews. So but I'm happy to be proven wrong. But I just think it's slightly problematic to say, yeah, we should still be taking refugees into the UK and affording them refugee status on account of war, when most people are remaining in Ukraine. And if they are nearer war zones, there are internally displaced people who aren't leaving. And we're happy to say, well, yeah, they're fine to be internally displaced people having refugee status kind of within Ukraine, and we are hopefully supporting them as allied nations with money, finances, the Ukrainian government to support those people. And as it mentioned here, no, I can't remember. No, it's in the Guardian article, which is they can relocate to safer parts of Ukraine where there are public services, and they can apply for help from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and local organisations to avoid destitution. And as long as we're doing our level best to make sure that Ukrainians aren't being left destitute by becoming internally displaced people, then I think the best option is to support Ukrainians staying in Ukraine as much as possible. The question is, when does a country become, as a whole, unlivable to the point where you justify everyone becoming a refugee? And of course, at that stage, then you've got 30 million people suddenly moving. So these are complex things, and there are arguments going both ways, and I understand the arguments going both ways. Just like with the strikes on Iran, I understand the arguments, that all the arguments were valid going both ways. It's not like that's a bad argument. No, it's like, no, that's a really good argument, but I just think the weighting over on this side is marginally better. I did change my mind on that, but only sort of to being marginally disapproving. And here I somewhat disapprove. So I'm about a 60% for this. But I could be, persuaded otherwise. But don't think I'm like going at this hard, and therefore I'm a terrible human if you disagree with me. I'm not saying that that's what Matt says, of course. This is the sort of thing where we'd sit down and have a pint over, and we'd talk this over, and you thrash out your ideas. But I'm also careful to differentiate those people who sought asylum initially and in the earlier parts of the war, because I think it's completely justified. Then you get onto interesting discussions about, well, then if they've then set down roots in those countries, can you send them back then? Should you send them back now? So I was careful to say that new applications, I think, should be turned down. But what happens when people are going from sort of a temporary protected status to applying for refugee status? They've already been there for a couple of years. There are loads of grey areas here, and I don't know enough about the finer details of what is in place legally and practically for these people, both in the UK and anywhere else that Ukrainians are seeking help and to start a new life. But it is certainly a challenge for the Ukrainians. They need people, and losing people, it doesn't help them in the war. It's a real challenge for them. But also, I do understand that families want to be as safe as possible, and as families with connections abroad as well, it's much easier for them to go and try and make a life somewhere else, and to therefore be even safer. So I get all the arguments. I'd be interested to see what you guys think. Try and persuade me otherwise. It's not that I'm like anti-refugee or anything like this. I just think at some point things move from A to not A on a spectrum, and I'm now at a point where I think, yeah, this is not A, and it would be useful for Ukraine to be able to keep hold of these people. Anyway, it's probably very controversial. Let me know what you think. Take care. Speak to you soon.